It is wonderful to have you all here with us. Here at Eastern State, we do a lot of work together. I will say we probably usually don't call each other by our last names a lot, which is why we're getting used to it. But one of the best things we've done in the last year and a half is a new program called Justice 101. This is ways we can get to current conversations that impact the justice system through incarceration, through pipelines to incarceration, through reentry programs with great minds around the country and bring it to you through the online programs or on-site programs. It's been really, really fun. But one thing that we've been dying to do and haven't done for a while is go live from Eastern State. And so that's what we get to do today. This is our grand finale of the year. This is our last online Justice 101, basically until the summer programs start, so not too long. So we thought, Bug and I thought it would be amazing to take you on a little tour of Eastern State and to teach you about not just incarceration, but the idea behind the word penitentiary, the idea behind Eastern State, and what makes it such a fascinating place, but also anchors it in our American history and our justice system, even before this site was open. So really quickly, I'm going to walk you through a little bit about Eastern State, but as we go through this program, Bug is going to walk us through the different sites, 3 different areas on this site, and tell us more about the people that were here. And so I want to ground our work before we start talking about Eastern State, before we start talking about incarceration in America. I want to ground our work for a moment in people. So much of the work we do, we talk about preservation and we talk about incarceration, we talk about the justice system, but all of this wraps around people directly. And Buck is going to walk us through some really important stories that we need to be sharing. What's fascinating about these conversations and these stories is they give us insight, not just to the people themselves and the lives that they may have lived here for a period of time or for a long period of time, but they also give us insight into the social context of the time and the political construct of that time. So we're going to try to unpack all those pieces. So I'm going to walk us really quickly through why we do this here at Eastern State. So one, just to anchor it in Philadelphia, because this site is in Philadelphia. I know some of you have been here, but some of you have not. So we're glad to give you a glimpse of it. But Philadelphia, I'm a Philadelphian and we have a lot of pride in not just our city and not just the amazing, food of our city, but also the firsts of our city. So there's a lot of firsts in Philadelphia. And there's the first lending library, the first art museum, first computer, first zoo is Philadelphia. And we also have the first penitentiary in the world is here in a large scale setting at Eastern State. It is open in 1829 with the first person who came to this site. And that's Charles Williams. Charles Williams was only 18 years old and he was taken from a local jail and he was incarcerated here at Eastern State. He was convicted of larceny and he was considered prisoner number 1. Now, Bug is going to explain to us why they numbered prisoners and what that means about the mission and the idea behind Eastern State when we go through this tour. But when we think about this time period and we think about this moment, we're thinking about people and reinventing how the world, not just America, not just the newly formed America, incarcerated people, but how we see justice. And when we think about the founding era of 1776 with the Declaration, the founding era of 1787 with the Constitution, this concept and this idea began before that. It began in early 1787 when people, the great minds of our country, were coming together in Philadelphia and they were watching some of those most painful and very brutal ways to punish people. There weren't many prisons in America at the time. There was about 3. And they said, we should do this better. If we are telling the world we believe in liberty and freedom, we believe in justice for all, that is a part of we the people. It's not just how we treat our people and the rights that we give, but how do we treat our people when we remove those rights? So this is clearly anchored in who we are at Eastern State. I want to read our mission to you because we just updated our mission and refreshed our mission, vision, and values. And I think it really ties back to that original idea of Eastern State that Bug's going to walk us through, that original idea that all people have the right to not just have liberty and freedom, but when the government takes it away, because of the power that it's given by the people, have a right to claim that back, have a right to have dignity, have hope, and have individualism, and a right to have humanity in everything they do. So Eastern State Penitentiary Historic Site preserves America's first penitentiary. Our job is to advance the public understanding of the whole of the criminal justice system and the impact that it has on the lives of those affected by it. And this work is done to inspire a more just future. Our goal at Eastern State, our vision, our big idea is to think about a world and a criminal justice system that treats everybody with fairness and dignity. And that brings us back to the beginning story. So when we talk about solitary confinement, when we talk about these ideas that were being populated in 1787 and this site that was opened in 1829, we go back to these core ideas of fairness and dignity. Now, let's start looking at the space. And Bug, maybe you can walk us through some people, some spaces, and give us a little context around what we're looking at. And I'm going to pin him for everyone so you guys can all see this closely. Over to you, Bug.
All right. Well, again, thank you guys so much for joining us at Justice 101. We got a little camera issue right there. Yeah, we'll write it real quick. I'm standing in the center of Eastern State Penitentiary, a 10.5-acre site, a massive site. And the center is part of the original construction. Because this place is 200 years old, obviously a lot of it is in ruin. And in fact, though, we're going to see a lot of spaces that are fixed up and, in fact, preserved, and even one space potentially that is somewhat renovated or, restored. There's a lot of spaces like cell block 5 right now that are completely closed off, that are still in ruin. And so this space is extremely old, of course, 200 years. But when we closed in 1971, that's pretty recent too. I mean, there's 2 people who are incarcerated here who are still in prison in the state of Pennsylvania. That being said, like Kerry mentioned, obviously because we're so old, person who's labeled number 1, Charles Williams, the first person to be here, has a pretty significantly different treatment than the people in 1971. Charles Williams, being the first person who's incarcerated at Eastern State, was under a penitentiary system, the Pennsylvania system. And the intention of this was that he would be in solitary confinement for most of the day, 23 hours of the day, and he might see some staff members like a moral instructor throughout the day, go out to an exercise yard for 2 half-an-hour blocks. We're going to get a chance to see some of those cells and what they might look like. That being said, that changes pretty significantly too, though he would be have access to a lot of religious rehabilitation, certainly initially. Not much later, only a few decades later, Seneca Plymley, number 75 at Eastern State, has a significantly different treatment. And he's actually one of the subjects of a McKelvey report, a report that kind of talks about the corruption and sometimes the real institutional problems that cause this place to really fail in a lot of senses. In fact, Seneca Plymley is subject to a lot of punishments that, though not approved by the board or by the inspectors here, were reported in the McKelvey report and are pretty gruesome. Now, this is a huge change between this time period, Charles Williams and Seneca Plymley, and it's kind of a precursor to some of the issues that solitary confinement and the Pennsylvania system has here. Now, I'm talking about their names certainly, but when they were at Eastern State, they were only referred to as the prisoner numbers. The core concept initially was anonymity. You can't judge the person as someone who's a criminal before you judge them as a human being. And if you see them here, see them later on the street, maybe you think about them as a human being first. That's how they say it publicly, at least at first. That being said, of course, judging people by their numbers only and not by their names also is seen as pretty dehumanizing. So there's different perspectives constantly to many different things at Eastern State. And as we go around to different sites here, we're going to talk more about this in terms of Eastern State's history and solitary confinement and the history of solitary in the United States overall. So I'll pass it over to Kerry. We're going to move to the next location, talk a little bit more about how this place gets developed in the first place.
Wait, before you go, Can you guys do a zoom in of that cell block 5 for me? Like get a little straight on that. Oh, we lost you.
Do you see me now? Yeah.
Yes. Can you guys, so Bug, if you go to the side a little and if you guys could walk a little closer so we can see straight down it. Awesome. Okay, great. That was really fascinating, Bug. Thank you for kind of that framing and that understanding of where you are in the space, but also kind of the history of Eastern State. And I found this the most interesting. So I've been here about a little under 2 years. And what I found the most fascinating about Eastern State is that it's a preserved ruin. So when you look down, and they turn the camera back on, when you look down that hallway straight through, what you see is what Bug shared with us, that moment of the moment that it closed in 1971. There you go. Perfect. Can you get a little closer? Walk closer there. I'm like physically making him zoom in. So it's like a snapshot in time. And for historians and for history nerds, this is like our favorite thing. A living giant time capsule. And Eastern State is more than just a ruin. It is a place where education, where history, and where justice all convene together. But what we want to show is not just one moment of the past, not one moment of 1829 or one moment of 1901 or one moment of 1954. We want to show all the different layers of history because as preservationists, if you choose to bring this moment back to 1840, you remove all the history. This is a living, breathing space that had layers of history. And it's really fascinating to understand this. Now, what we're going to do is dive a little bit deeper into what were prison sites and incarceration sites before Eastern State opened, and what was the idea behind it? And Bug, you're going to jump to your next location. Am I correct on that? Great. Okay, awesome. So I'm going to take over and screen share while you move. We wanted to make sure that we all didn't have to have Dramamine today. And so you guys are moving to your next location, right?
Yeah.
Yep. Okay. See you on the other side. Let me know when you're back. Okay, everyone. So here's a little an image for you that we're seeing there. And what you're looking at is the Newgate prison in London. And so for our friends over in the pond in the UK right now, shout out to you all. This is an image that we use quite often to talk about Walnut Street Jail because it is a really impressive way to understand what jails were like prior to sites like Eastern State. There were people of all ages in there. There were people of all different crimes in there. There were men and there were women and there were children in there all at once. Food was not always something that was given. It was most often not. And when people came in, they had to pay the person in charge of the jail, the officer in charge of the jail. And if they didn't have enough money, they would strip them down and take their clothes and sell them. So there was almost a law of its own and a cage of its own. And what you were in there for is until you were awaited your trial and your punishment. So Walnut Street Jail is directly in front of Independence Hall in Philadelphia or the Pennsylvania State House at the time. So when you go, if you've ever been to Independence Hall and you look at that majestic building, there's a large front kind of lawn area. It was directly across the street from there. And inside Independence Hall, one room is where they wrote the Declaration, where they wrote and signed the Constitution. And across that hallway, just through a small, I want to say like 8 feet brick hallway, that's where the courts were happening. And outside is where public punishment happened. So you have these great minds thinking about freedom and justice and fairness, dabbling with these ideas from Locke and looking at this idea of giving consent to the governed to have a government. And how do we not only be a fair and just system, but how do we ensure safety? And they thought we have to do this better. The experimentation begins way before Eastern State is opened at Walnut Street Jail. And this is where they begin to experiment with solitary confinement. And solitary confinement is the idea that the Quakers came up with. And a few others before that, the ideas go back to England and other countries and say, if we put people in solitude by themselves, the Quakers said that you'd be able to find your inner light, that you'd be able to hear God. Other beliefs and other religious beliefs came from the monks where they would be in solitude alone. And that's what would stop bad behavior. Now, we understand today that so often that people were put in places like Eastern State, in Walnut Street Jail, and in jails today who are not committing crimes, who are unjustly treated, but also people who don't have proper medical attention, proper health attention. All these pieces, these societal pieces play into this. And there are also people that commit direct crimes. So how do we engage in this conversation and talk about human dignity and look at a way to balance who we are as a society? And I'm going to turn it back to Bug to kind of dive a little bit deeper into the location he has at Eastern State. Bug, I'm going to pin you again.
All right, sounds good. So folks, I'm standing in a restored section of cell block 1, the first cell block built at Eastern State. When we open this place up, it has 7 cell blocks, and that does increase pretty significantly. But when we first open up, the cell doors that you might see if you were at Eastern State visiting, or I'm about to show you kind of inside of, were not here. In fact, initially, it was just these feeding holes right here. The core concept being that people at Eastern State in solitary confinement wouldn't be communicating with each other. Though it initially certainly started as a Quaker kind of concept about religious rehabilitation and people being in these rooms with penitence and solitude, reflecting on the morality of their crimes, Eastern State then quickly also moves to explain this opportunity, at least in their mind, their wording, for rehabilitation in a less religious view as well. Eastern State, their intention, kind of unlike in some ways solitary confinement nowadays, was to have no one else incarcerated here ever see each other, as opposed to the more modern concept of having people see really no one at all, or at least not very many people. Now, Eastern State, when they open up, they have 500 cells split up into these 700 cell blocks, 7 cell blocks, excuse me. I'm going to show you a restored cell that we have right here, one over here. This is in cell block 1. This is the kind of cell that Charles Williams or Seneca Plymley might have had when they were at Eastern State initially. First of all, you'll see this door right here, although initially they would have a metal grate door and then a wooden door over it, a big fire issue, not having a door in the hallway. Now, you also see inside a bed and a stool, some work kind of tables and conditions, people working.
I think you're cutting out a little bit, Bug.
Very back of
the
cell that last be in these cells for 23 hours a day with 2 half-an-hour blocks in their exercise yards. Oh, can you still hear me?
Now we can. Great.
Awesome, great. It's filming in a 200-year-old castle-like building. But people would be in their exercise yards for 2 half-an-hour blocks each day at different times as their neighbors because they wanted to prevent people from yelling over the wall and communicating with each other. Now, there's some logistical issues that they run into without a doubt. In fact, eventually, this place gets criticized pretty significantly for inhumane treatment of people incarcerated here, including an 1895 grand jury indictment of Eastern State being inhumanely unsanitary. As things change here, solitary cells, the cells that they add change pretty significantly. But the work conditions, they were kind of trying to maintain those same work conditions. Most of the time, this place is open. In fact, the vast majority of the time that Eastern State is open, every single person incarcerated here, unless it's a and initially, during the solitary confinement era in Pennsylvania's system of everyone being in solitary, that meant people working jobs, usually manual labor, furniture building jobs, inside of their cells, in solitary confinement, in complete and total silence. There's obviously logistical issues with this too. People come in here, men, women, and children as young as 9 years old, who often don't have those work skills. Teaching those people was incredibly difficult, given the small staff size they have here, the unlikelihood that you'd have volunteers coming in, and the lack of money, or at least limited money, to be able to pay people from the outside. Now, it runs into pretty significant logistical issues, this place, and we'll talk more about that and the same issues they run into with solitary confinement nowadays and other facilities as we go on through. I'll hand it back up to Kerry.
Thanks. And hold on for 1 minute, because I think we're going to ask you a couple questions as we go through. So let me do a couple things. So, Bug, and we'll do just like a baby interview here, and then we'll jump in. So
great, yeah, I can answer some questions.
So just like giving it the founding and the framing. So it's not simply just a prison. This idea is years in the making, and it epitomizes like a unique philosophy about penal treatment. Like it changes the globe, it changes the world and how we see this penal treatment. And it is under the idea that this inner light is in people that we talked about before, and that this solitude would be a way to let that inner light shine out. So typically during the day, as you said before, you're about 30 minutes out in the morning in that small yard that you're going to show us later, and then 30 minutes out in the afternoon in that small yard. There were 2 kind of people that would come to help give you a trade. There would be clergy, religious clergy that would come give you a trade. So, and there would also be people from the community, Philadelphians, that from the get-go were always allowed to come in and check on the space. So can you tell us a little bit about the prison society and the history of the prison society and how it's the genesis, what it is and what they do today, and then how it's the genesis of Eastern State and how they kept a citizen watch on people who were incarcerated. So could you tell us a little bit about that?
Absolutely. So yeah, as you were saying, the Pennsylvania Prison Society today is an advocacy group working to support people who are currently incarcerated, people who are formerly incarcerated and reentering society, working to support people that often kind of pretty disadvantaged by the system that, though at Eastern State was intended to help people, is quite harmful nowadays a lot of the times. Now, this committee is incredibly old, and like Kerry was saying, this committee is the committee that essentially starts Eastern State. Although back then they had a different name, they were called the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons. And at their core were a significant amount of Quaker beliefs. Quakers had a lot of political power early on, a little bit before Eastern State in the 1700s, and then up until, of course, when we open as well. And at that time, yeah, that inner light concept, that idea of sitting in solitude, reflecting internally on the morality of what you did, was the core concept of solitary confinement. The Pennsylvania Prison Society, or that long name that they had back then, their idea of Eastern State was that that solitude, that individual meditation or prayer was how people would be rehabilitated here. Now, I grew up Quaker myself, and what I can say is that a lot of the focus, at least Quakers at that time, was really internal in terms of how are people going to reflect on the morality of their crimes. And at Eastern State, when people were in solitary confinement, the idea, at least specifically, would be that they would be in these spaces, completely silent, totally the entire time, punishable by eating bread and water only for a week, unfortunately. And that these conditions would be conducive to people becoming better people. Now, like you were saying, this is supported and kind of specifically inspected by people from the community and people in this committee, the Philadelphia Society for Alleviating the Miseries of Public Prisons. You had notable Quakers, notable prison policymakers, lawmakers, people coming into Eastern State to make sure that these policies, these solitary confinement conditions, the Pennsylvania system itself, were actually doing what they say they were going to be doing, improving people's lives, making them better people. And certainly there was failings in this too. You had a few years where people didn't come as much as they should. And a lot of the times they caught a lot of issues. And the Cully report we're talking about with Seneca Plymley is one of the big kind of examples of this. That being said, this kind of community-wide support for the Pennsylvania system becomes really notable. And at the end,
We'll give him a minute to come back. It is a very thick walled prison castles that we are working in. It's not an active prison, just to remind everybody. But we do lose signals in these long, thick walls. You can see how thick that wall is that into the cell. Remember, that cell door wouldn't have been there. That would have been closed up. Okay, but we can hear you again.
Museum itself. I think
Okay, so I'll step back in as we get Bug back on track. So the thing that I find really fascinating about this moment in time is that this urgency and this movement for this group of Quakers and other leaders in the community to come together to set up a new way of doing this happens because a year before, there is a new law in Pennsylvania that changes public punishment and public scrutiny of people that create crimes. They were sent to do public works. It was extremely demoralizing. It was shameful. It was almost like you got a scarlet letter that you could never shake. And they also believed it was creating people to be more corrupt as they left the system because they were not able to get good jobs after that. And they were also the belief was that they were meeting each other and then they would commit. I don't know what went on there, but we're all back. So the belief was that there was extreme worry that they would be committing crimes together. So it was 37 members of the original charter that came together and said, we want to do something differently. This is who comes up with the idea of having, and I'm going to get you that picture that I promised you before, a better system than what they saw at Walnut Street Jail. Some of those notable members, Benjamin Rush, who was brilliant behind the scenes about, that angle between policy and reform and medical as well. But then there's Ben Franklin is another one. So a major people, 37 altogether, come up with this idea. They begin to test it out in Walnut Street Jail in small cases. Now, here's the thing. The idea sounds really smart. And what Bug shared with us earlier is that people were also fed very light food and rations. That was a part of the system, that your body was in a calorie deficit is the easiest way to say it in modern times. But at the same time, you were in solitude, so you quietly reflected. Again, going back to those Quaker and Buddhist beliefs to find that inner light. To us today, we understand how this sounds like a violation of the Eighth Amendment. We understand the negative impact that solitary confinement has on the health and well-being of human beings. We are not solitary creatures. They were so committed to solitary confinement at Eastern State. And I'm going to show you a picture of what the spaces look like as I have you and as Bug comes back. That they were so committed to these spaces, to really lock into these spaces, they put bathrooms in every single cell because you couldn't fully commit to solitary confinement if people were leaving to go to the bathroom. They would see each other in the hall, they would talk to the guards, all these spaces. So as we think about this space, and I'm going to show you really quickly, this is the site the Bug is standing in right now. He's in this center area right here, which is the center of the blueprint that you see as well. All of this work is really coming up with the idea that can we do it differently? But at the same time, there was no humility in the group. There was no humility in the people that wanted to do this work. And so when they started to begin to test it at Walnut Street Jail, they very quickly saw pain, anguish, and deterioration of people. They saw that solitary confinement within a short period of time was causing major mental health crisis, but yet they still went forward with it. And they created a prison that was fully 24 hours a day in solitary confinement. The counterpart to this at the time was what we call today a Sing Sing prison. And that was during the day, it was quiet, but you were in small groups. And at night, you were alone in your cell. This was a fully informed place of solitary. Now, Bug, I'll turn it back to you.
Thank you very much. Yeah, we cut out for a little bit, but absolutely right. When they opened this space up, including the center room that we're standing in right now, this place 24/7 in solitary confinement with the intention of having people never communicate, needed a innovative and really kind of complex, in a sense, surveillance system. So one of the things that we talk about in this place at Eastern State being so innovative, aside from just the Pennsylvania system, was the radial design that the building is designed after. A design that later on, as surveillance architecture itself, is talked about as inherently violent. I mean, the concept that the cell blocks kind of are set up in a way, I'll show you in a second, that means that someone could be seeing into your cell or right through your, like right outside the entrance of your cell at any given time without you knowing, is pretty foreboding. So I'm going to show you what this means. When Eastern State opens up, we have 7 cell blocks initially. We were talking initially through cell block 1 right here. But as we go on in a circle from the central surveillance hub, you see all of the original 7 cell blocks, and even some of the cell blocks they added through later on. Now, when this place is built with the 7 cell blocks they have at Eastern State, we look a lot like this. This is a model we have here of the initial 7 cell blocks. But then later on, they add 8 more cell blocks and have 15 in total. So I want to show you one example over here. On cell blocks 8 and 9, when they add these extensions, they have the mirrors down this hallway over here, if you look over, to see around the corners of the actual cell blocks themselves. This is one of the things that Eastern State is really, really known for, but the notable kind of design gets copied 330 prisons wide. And the policies here, the Pennsylvania system, the use of solitary confinement in prisons, the way that we do, is also copied in that same way. We see solitary is pretty common around the United States, though often under different names. And obviously, this is kind of not the case 200 or so years ago when Eastern State first uses it. This is one of the examples architecturally, but also policy-wise, that gets spread around the country a lot. So I'll pass it over to Kerry, and we're going to move over to some modern solitary cells in a moment.
I'm going to ask you a couple questions before you leave us, because this is always fun. So come back to me.
Sounds good.
Okay. Yeah, 350 different sites around the world. So this is an experiment, again, another experiment in Philadelphia on how do we have democracy? How do we have a system of democracy and a system of rule of law? So we hear that all the time with the Declaration, we hear it with the Constitution, and we hear it with the framing and founding of Eastern State. So tell me a little bit about some of our famous people that have visited. So, we have a lot of history teachers and history students on here, some AP classes. So tell me some good names there who are big visitors that wanted to see this experiment in Philadelphia, or what the locals call the Cherry Hill Prison.
Yeah, I'm muted. All right, absolutely. Well, we have a lot of famous visitors at Eastern State. When we first opened this place up, the intention is to show the country, if not the world, that this is how prisons should be. And one of the first notable people who visits is Charles Dickens. Charles Dickens, the writer from England, comes to a lot of the different locations around Eastern, kind of East Coast, and visits Eastern State as well. And he's actually one of the first notable public condemnations of Eastern State. Now, he has a personal connection. His father is kind of experiencing a lot of these solitary conditions himself. And when Charles Dickens gets to this place, he's told by the people who run Eastern State that as a penitentiary system, it is intended to make people better people. He interviews people who are in the cells and incarcerated here and goes into different exercise yards at Eastern State as well. And he tells a very different story. He says the torture here is worse than any other because of how silent it is. He talks about the kind of slow, agonizing, monotonous routine, not really as something that might help people, but as something that causes, though he uses different terms, significant mental health issues. But he's not the only notable figure who visits Eastern State. You also have Tocqueville, a pretty kind of well-known French diplomat who comes to Eastern State just a few years later and sees this place in a very different light than Charles Dickens. In fact, specifically, he talks about the kind of merits of the Pennsylvania system and solitary confinement, about how it might make people better people. He talks about why this place is going to be very successful, how it should be copied around the entire world. You have notable figures like these two publicly disagreeing, and Eastern State's controversy for the decades and decades that it's open is around this disagreement, not just institutionally, but the individual people who are incarcerated here, about whether or not solitary confinement might make people better people or might be incredibly damaging. So certainly, I mean, these publications that are kind of talking about Eastern State around this time come out publicly and people see this disagreement. This controversy is really public a lot of the times.
And that's great. I think that's so fascinating what you said, Bug. And I really, when we unpack it, and just to get our years right, de Tocqueville comes in 1831 and Charles Dickens comes in 1842. So it's a 10-year difference. One might say, like, well, what's the big difference between the two? And you said it so clearly, and I just want to echo it and like amplify it. The difference is Charles Dickens had lived experience with incarceration. His father was in a prison, kind of like the Walnut Street jail image that we saw before. He saw the pain and the anguish of his father. He was in a debtor's prison. He watched his mother, his family. He was a young boy, and that impacted him. So when we talk about the criminal justice system, when we talk about the justice system, we always have conversations around people who are victims, people who are systems impacted and incarcerated. Some of the things that we want to make really clear is sometimes you can't separate those two. When we look at women in incarceration today, 85% of women who are incarcerated have been directly impacted by violent crimes on their body. 85%. So it's not these binaries, but it's also the families, it's the community, it's all these pieces. And I think it's really fascinating the way you lay that out. In 1831, in 1842, how do we have different perspectives? Because people's lenses are a little bit wider on what they're seeing. So that is wonderful, really, really helpful. Next location that you're going to bring us to is where, Bug?
We're going to go to a recreation of a more modern solitary cell that isn't in Eastern State and actually isn't officially in the United States. It's a recreation we have here, but it's an exhibit about Guantanamo Bay. And it's going to show you some of the conditions that people are in prisons nowadays, too. And it's a stark difference, though it's set in an Eastern State cell. I want to talk a little bit more about how solitary confinement is administered in the United States and some of the issues we see nowadays, too, and the connections to certainly how Eastern State ran back then.
Okay, we'll let you get to the next location because, again, it's about 11-acre site, so there's a lot of hustling going on around here. And I'm going to get us from 1840s and move us forward to the 20th century. So solitary confinement really starts to decline in the early 20th century, so the early 1900s. By 1913, it's completely gone from Eastern State. It had fallen apart before that because of the records that we know, and somebody asked this in the Q&A, there is extensive records that have been kept here. Not all of them are at this site. Some are at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C. Some are at local libraries around the country. Some are at the Philadelphia Historical Society, which is an amazing place in Philadelphia. It's the Pennsylvania Historical Society. Let me get the location right, but it is in Philadelphia. These records are fascinating. not all of these records are kept. We have objects here as well. It's an amazing archives. And just about a month ago, our teacher collaboratory from around the country came and they were able to see some of these archives directly. But what I think is really fascinating about the archives that we do have is they do tell the stories of so many people that were incarcerated here. But they're also telling the stories of people that lived here and people that worked here. So much of the prison team, the government team that lived here had families on site. There were children born here. There were many children born here. So the people who worked here and the people that were incarcerated here, and the children stayed for a while. We can see a lot of those stories, but most of them are told through the lens of the people in power and in government here at Eastern State. So the law enforcement officers, their families and their wives. But my favorite part of Eastern State is that it also had journalism. It had a complete newspaper. So much of the work that was being done in the cells, if extra work was done, people who were incarcerated here were allowed to sell the materials that they made, this beautiful art that they made on the outside of the giant wall that you see behind me through my window. And they would put ads in that newspaper, but they also wrote letters. There's a fascinating series of letters around tolerance, around prohibition. And this was the movement before the prohibition era that really helped get people excited and understanding that, let's be honest, our country had a drinking problem, and that became a domestic violence problem. So women were incarcerated here because they fought back when they were being beaten, and because of their outcomes, they were incarcerated. So you see so many of their letters and their stories in that piece of journalism. And what I find fascinating about this, and thank you for putting that in the chat around that team, but I found fascinating about this is we think about rights, and we think about the rights that you have as a citizen. You think about the rights that you have as a person under the 14th Amendment. And then you think about the rights you have and you don't have while incarcerated. And the base rights that we all understand and live by are these natural rights. And these natural rights are ones that cannot be removed. And so many of our legal scholars across this way would say the First Amendment, even when we talk about Locke, when we talk about these famous ideas, the First Amendment is a natural right that no man and no government can take away. And you see that in the newspaper clippings. And that's when we hear the direct voice, maybe censored, but the direct voice of people who are incarcerated on site. Okay, back to you, Bug. I'd love to see where you are now. Hold on one second. You're still muted.
All right. Thank you, Kerry. We're standing outside of a cell in Eastern State, cell block 10, but in a moment I'm going to show you it's been redesigned on the inside to look very different. It's designed to look like one of the cells at Guantanamo Bay. So obviously Eastern State, closing in 1971, doesn't have a lot of modern solitary cells, but this one designed to look pretty different than obviously Eastern down here. It looks a lot like...
Guys, hey, back up out of the cell. We can't hear you. Sorry, again, everybody,
one of the
these
big
walls
issues
are
we
so
see,
thick.
certainly with surveillance. Right. I mean, it's completely open on every side. And obviously the setup that you have in the cell right here is very different to the one that Eastern State has. That being said, Eastern State had its issues with solitary confinement and the mental health problems here and a lot of the conditions being pretty terrible. This is happening right now. And these Guantanamo Bay cells are being used, certainly talk about being used more and more. Solitary confinement in the United States now has kind of a very different look, a very different view. Certainly people call it many different things because a lot of the policies around the use of solitary confinement are restrictive based on specifically calling it solitary. So for instance, you have programs in many states like administrative isolation, which don't actually look a lot different and have a lot of the same exact issues. In fact, though obviously it's controversial, many people say it's just renamed essentially. Now, Guantanamo Bay is one good example, but the prisons in the United States that use a lot of these kind of policies and procedures that Eastern State starts in this kind of concept of rehabilitation in terms of making people better people, they're not focusing on rehabilitation in that sense. They're focusing specifically on punishment. A big kind of change to what Eastern State's policies were. Yeah.
Fascinating, very fascinating. And I think that's such a big part of the Eastern State story, that we see the boom of mass incarceration in America at the exact same time that Eastern State is closing. So it's literally the eastern side of the state's prison So that's why it's called Eastern State. We jokingly say that Alcatraz is West Eastern State, so it's Eastern State other. But in all reality, it's the east side of Pennsylvania. So it was the Pennsylvania prison, and then it became in 70 to 71 a Philadelphia owned property. But it's closed in 71. Yes, of course, because it was so expensive to upkeep. And it is a large, massive site, but it's also because it couldn't house the people. And this is when it starts to change. You have this boom of mass incarceration. And for so many reasons, as we've talked about today, but the law enforcement teams on these sites would also use solitary confinement as a punishment and as a safety mechanism for those as well. Now, Buck, can you tell us a little bit about what we know? And there's amazing sources like Solitary Watch and the Vera Institute that we can share in the chat with people, but I know we're coming close on time. So could you tell us a little about the devastating effects that we know scientifically fully that solitary confinement has on people today?
Yes, I can. So solitary confinement, one of the biggest mental health issues that we have associated with it is the solitude, I mean, the loneliness. We as social creatures rely on people in community. The kind of isolation that people experience, especially in long-term kind of periods, is really detrimental to people's ability to communicate and people's ability to emotionally kind of deal with a lot of the trauma that is experienced through this. Unfortunately, we have two really clear but tragic examples of the modern use of solitary confinement and some of the really terrible impacts that it has. Kalief Browder is one of the kind of, though of course, really dramatically sad and kind of traumatic examples of the clear problems that solitary and modern use experiences. Kalief Browder in 2010, as a 17-year-old, was put in solitary confinement for 800 days. And I should say, at that time, as a 17-year-old, he hadn't been charged with a crime. He was in Rikers. And when he's in solitary confinement for that period of time, he's experiencing this same loneliness, the solitude, the kind of essentially torture for longer than 15 days that the UN kind of categorizes as torture for a huge amount of time. And though his case eventually is dropped, while his family is kind of suing the state for this treatment and for this mistreatment, unfortunately, he commits suicide. The mental health conditions that are associated with this are devastating. And there's people who are in solitary for a lot longer. Albert Woodfox is a good example. He's the person who, at least to the records that we have, has been in solitary confinement for the longest in his lifetime. He was in solitary for 43 years. He was incarcerated there initially for a separate crime, but while he's incarcerated, he is accused of killing a correctional officer. And for this, though, again, that sentence gets dropped, he eventually spends solitary as a punishment for 43 years, along with a few of the people who are in that space known as the Angola Three, that are in solitary confinement for many of them upwards of 30 or 40 years. He eventually writes the book Solitary, his biography, and we have that in Eastern State, but you can find it online as well.
Thank you so much. And it is fascinating at this point in time, and I know you have another great graph in here, is we see 25 states writing state laws that solitary confinement cannot be more than 15 days. Only 25 states, even though we know all of this impact. But it doesn't mean you can't have 15 days and then out for a day and then back in. But we also, as a system of fairness and justice, as a justice system, we need to look at it holistically. And we need to, as a community, come together and say, why are prisons using this? What is the system that's setting this up? And how can we change the fact that this is so damaging to people and really unpack the system? This is where I want to, for really quickly, and then I have a couple questions for you, Bug, and then we'll wrap up. And anybody, if you have extra questions, put it in the chat or the Q&A. But what is really powerful are organizations, are community-based organizations like the Pennsylvania Prison Society. Their job is to go, still to this day in Pennsylvania, go into these sites and be able to check on people, check on conditions, check on people. We had a program that you can find on our YouTube channel called Worth Rises that looks at the economic impact. And the majority of people are kept in prisons that are run by the government on the state level. So there are federal prisons, state prisons, and private prisons. And the majority of people are in those state prisons. So real quick questions for you, Bug. And Tara asked a great question. What was the ratio of black and brown people and white people at Eastern State? Now you're going to have to pick a year, But do you have a general percentage of the time period, and what was the percentage?
Well, again, it does change pretty significantly over the years. That being said, at Eastern State, the percentage, like we see today, is still very differently represented than the general population around the city of Philadelphia and around the country. I'd say around the 19th century is a good kind of way to measure it, at least at the turn around that time period from the solitary system to the congregate system. And around that time, we have about 30 to 35% people at Eastern State who are people of color, who are labeled as Black. That being said, I say labeled as Black because our idea of race and how it's recorded at Eastern State is very different back then. I mean, this kind of labels that we use now are not used in the same way that they have back then. But still, even though that 30% number, and that is wildly different than the general population of Philadelphia, which was just about half of that, essentially.
Great. Thank you. Awesome. And now I'm going to go to the jump around question wise, but this is my favorite question because I love when everybody else is like a book nerd like me. So what are some of your preferred sources about solitary? And we're going to send a wrap up to everybody that has all these listed as well. And says, I see the prison policy initiative. I think that's fantastic. It gives a lot of good data if you're a data person. They are a great one to reference. I also made sure that I brought these in today so you could see them. This is our new favorite book that we're all obsessed with here. The Deviant Prison by Ashley Rubin. This is a really fascinating read. Another really good one when we talk about Charles Dickens is look at American Notes by Charles Dickens. That's when you'll see him talking about Eastern State. And another really good one is this one. It's The Prison at Philadelphia Cherry Hill. It's by Teeters and Shearer. It is old school. You can see all my little note tabs. These are some fascinating stories that will bring you back to that time period. And then modern conversations around this is look at the Pennsylvania Prison Society, the Prison Policy Initiative, the Vera Institute. EJI, Equal Justice Initiative, is another excellent one. Bug, any other ones that you would suggest that you love to go to as well?
Well, certainly. And it's a very different approach to information about solitary confinement. But and I kind of mentioned this, Solitary by Alfred Woodfox, I mean, his autobiography about his experience, we both had that at Eastern State, but again, you can find it. It gives not just the statistics, not just the information about the national use of solitary confinement, but the individual impacts, how he himself experienced it. And though it is a tragic read, again, I really recommend people check it out.
Great. And somebody in our chat, and I'm betting you this person's from Philadelphia, there is a ballot question on the Philadelphia ballot this May 20th. It's a referendum question. We just had a program on this last week, so thank you for that in. And it is the question of should there be a new citizen-based oversight commission on the ballot initiative. So if you're interested in that, you vote yes or no. If you want to learn more about that, you can check out our YouTube channel and you can watch the program on it. Isaiah Thomas, Councilman Isaiah Thomas was here talking about it, as well as the League of Women Voters, as well as the Prison Society. And so really fascinating. It was last Wednesday. Also, I just want to shout out our team has done this amazing series called Unlocking History that brings you through the stories of Eastern State, can get you close to those newspaper clippings, can get you close to this history, and allows you to dive into it in short bits. I think they're great for classrooms and great for an 8-minute watch. So many great questions in here. I really appreciate you all. I think Kayla asked a question, wondering if the practice of solitary confinement, regardless of label, has legally been determined as cruel and unusual punishment, and to what degree overcrowding and understaffing across facilities leads to the overuse. Oh, such a great question, Kayla. We're going to send you a lot of information on that. We can send you resources on the 28 states have banned it, where we've seen the cases in the courts at the state level and the federal level. And how do we really look at the Eighth Amendment? The Eighth Amendment and so many of those Bill of Rights when you're not incarcerated compared to when you are incarcerated. And that is a really hard concept for all of us to grapple with is this cruel and unusual? Is that acceptable when you're incarcerated? Is that not acceptable when you're not incarcerated? Because those Bill of Rights are really about the general citizen. And does it all apply in the same ways while you're incarcerated? We're really excited about that. In September, we're going to have a program on the Eighth Amendment directly and diving into that deeply. We did a program in, I think, January on the Fourth Amendment in policing as well. So this was so much fun. We'll try to get you some answers and link some sources. But Bug, you are fantastic. I know the site is really difficult to do this with, but I had a great time. Thank you so much. Everybody give Bug a round of applause.
Thank you all very much. They built this place without Wi-Fi, and so a lot of times getting Wi-Fi through it. But I can also say thank you guys very much for joining. It was a blast.
Thank you. And everybody have a great season. We'll see you on Juneteenth. We are good. I think we're still live, but Bugs, we will call all the questions. Thank you. Great job.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. You guys have great questions. I can't wait to do this one again. Great. Thank you. I couldn't even tell it was back on there, Allie.
Yeah, the host permissions got messed around a little with our tech issues, but I got it.
Why did it crash? That was the weirdest part. Like, did somebody shut it down by accident?
I have no idea.
Because I was gonna say, I was like, okay, I think so. Like, I think it actually might have crashed in the cell block, and that crashed the whole thing. But I think I can fix that the next time. Thank you, Jeff. You're so nice. Thanks for being here. We're experimenting.